Okay, we're going to finish up on principles of design today and then have a little bit of review, just have you look at some slides and talk about them for a few things. We don't have a whole lot more to talk about for principles of design. One of this, we finished this last time, this was about rhythm. So one of the other guidelines is called proportions and scale. And scale refers to the size of objects in a work of art in relationship to the normal size or the constant size that we expect something to be in. And so, and if you think about model planes or model cars, the guys maybe know more about it than the girls do. We refer to that as miniature scale, because they're very small in comparison to what a real car looks like or an airplane. Or as you see here in this work, we could talk about how this green apple that you see here is way out of normal scale, that it's been enlarged extremely. The artist has drawn what looks like or painted, what looks like a room behind it. Here are the moldings up at the top. Here's the ceiling, a window. And so he gives us little clues that tell us, that this apple is way out of scale, that, we don't expect to see a green apple that fills an entire room. So that's what scale means. And then proportion means the size of parts of an object to the whole object. For example, you might have a figure that has too large a head for the size of the body. And so we could say that's out of proportion. And then, of course, the question is why? Why did the artist do it? Was he incompetent? Probably not. There's probably some deliberate reason that the artist made that head larger than the rest of the body. Maybe, there was some concept that he wanted to stress about thinking or, and so he decides he'll enlarge the head because that's where, we think in our brains. It might be for some expression, something like that. I'm going to show you some examples of that. Or it could be, a part in relationship to the whole composition. And so again, we could talk about this green apple being out of proportion to the room that it's in, because it looks like it must be a part of that room. The artist seems to deliberately put it in the room. And so why is it so large? Why is it out of proportion to the rest of the room? So, those are the differences between, what proportion is in art and what scale is in art. And for this particular one, this artist, René Magritte, was a surrealist artist. And so the surrealist artists often distorted things. Dali would make things, look like two different things at the same time. He'd create limp watches when we know watches aren't limp. Or, René Magritte, uses a very large apple in a very small room. And so when the surrealists do that, they usually want us to think. They want us to think about reality, or they want us to think about, their view of reality, that there are these other levels of reality. And so they're trying to get us to think about it by, sort of, shocking us when we see something and we say, that's not right. It's not supposed to be so large. Proportion and scale can also be used for other reasons. And I've mentioned this before. It can be used in this way as hieratic scaling, and that word hieratic means symbolic. Or hierarchical proportioning means that they sort of set a standard. Some things are more important than other things, and so we're going to make those larger than other things. And this is the kind of thing that was often done in religious art. When an artist wanted to show a god and wanted to show the difference between a god and a normal human being if they were in the same painting, then usually the god would be made bigger. And so, for example, here in this work, These are saints. These are the patron saints, the guardian saints of these women that you see kneeling down here in the front. And these saints are much bigger. You know, they look like they're giants in size in comparison to the size here of this woman. You know, she's kneeling down, but even if she stood up, she's not going to be as tall as the saints behind her. She's not going to have as much volume as, you know, she isn't going to have as much weight as the saints. And so this artist did that to say, you know, those are saints, these are ordinary people. You know, these are real living people. And this was done at a time in the Renaissance when they didn't want to use halos. So, you know, that wasn't a way to show who was a saint or a god. And so they had to find some other way to do it. And so this artist says, well, I'll just make them really big, you know, make them much larger. And so this is what is called symbolic scaling or hierarchical proportioning. And so in religious art, you know, this would be a reason to do it. They know that, you know, some people aren't this much bigger than other people. It's just in order to symbolize, you know, that they're more important or they're saints in comparison to the women that are in front. And you see the same kind of thing here, just to give you another religion, in, you know, this statue of Buddha. This is in a cave in northern China. And the Buddha is much larger, as you can tell from the size of the people that are standing down here, than, you know, ordinary people are. And again, that size is meant to say, this is Buddha, this is a god, this is, you know, someone much more important than ordinary individuals are important. Then another reason sometimes that proportions will be changed from normal is if an artist is trying to convey a concept, some idea, and it's usually an idea that the culture has. And if you look at this, you're probably saying to yourself, well, there doesn't look like there's anything wrong with that. It looks like a normal human being. And he really does. That was a part of what the Greeks were trying to do. They were trying to create a naturalistic art. But they were also doing something more. The Greeks based their whole life on the idea of order, you know, of logic, of rationality. And so to them, order was beauty. And so in this artist, when he created this work, he's not just representing one particular individual, you know, one man that looked like this. What he's done, and he wrote a little pamphlet that we have, so we know that this is what he did. He said that he took the parts, he looked at lots of different individuals, and he tried to decide what is the most perfect proportion for each part of the human body. And he didn't find all of those perfect proportions in just one person. He found them in lots of different people, so he added them together and he created this figure. And in his writing, you know, he says that the finger from, you know, the tip of the finger to the first knuckle is in a proportion, his idea of proportion, to the second knuckle, to the finger, to the hand to the arm, you know, the forearm to the whole arm. All of this was mathematically worked out. So it isn't, you know, just an individual person. This is no one person. He even decided that the correct way to do it was to use the height of a head and then to multiply that head to get the perfect height for an individual. And for Polyclitus, he believed that the perfect height of an individual was 8 heads high. And so if you take, you know, the measurement of that head, you can multiply it 8 times and you'll get the height of the figure. Later on, the Greeks changed their mind and they decided, no, figures should be 10 heads high. So, you know, everything here is being worked out in a mathematical sort of way. It doesn't just, you know, represent one individual. So that is a reason why also normal proportions have been changed by this artist to express this concept of order, mathematical order, and of beauty as the Greeks saw it. Then another reason that normal proportions may be changed may be for expression. And that's what El Greco does here. El Greco was an Italian artist who was born on a Greek island, so that's where he got his name, El Greco. And he worked in Spain for the Spanish monarch in Spain. And his style is very exaggerated. You know, you can see this is Jesus here at the resurrection. And you see he's very tall and thin, has a very thin head. If you would think about how many, heads high is he looks like maybe he's about 12 heads high. And so, everything has sort of been stretched out and elongated. And the reason that El Greco did that was he thought that in that way he could sort of express the intensity of emotion that he felt about religion. And that's why he exaggerated the proportions. So, for purposes of expression or emotion, sometimes artists, will change what are normal proportions in a figure. That brings us to the final guideline that we're going to talk about, and that is balance. In art, balance means stability. Or you could also think of it as harmony, that things look like they weigh equal amounts on each side of an invisible sort of axis. And I want to flip on here. We're talking about visual weight, not actual weight. So let me just get on here and I'll come back to this for a minute so you can copy it. If you look at this artist actually gave us a vertical line, in this little panel here that sort of divides this composition into two equal parts. And so in every work of art, doesn't matter what kind of balance is being used, it's always implied that there's this central axis that divides a work in half so that you have equal halves on both sides of the work of art. And then it depends on how the artist, how they place objects, how many objects, the kind of color that's used on each side, what kind of balance you have. And so now let me go back to this screen where I gave you some explanation of this. It's, it's a visual weight, not an actual weight. So it doesn't mean that an artist is going to have two people on one side of that invisible axis and two on the other, necessarily. It's rather if there's three figures on one side and two on the other, do the two seem like they have that same weight, or do they have that sense of heaviness that you have in the three people that are on the other side? Or it could be two apples and three apples, or it could be any kind of thing like that. So it's really, as I said, it's more about feelings, that you feel that things are equal on both sides than that you have the same number of things on both sides. So we're talking about visual weight, and I always stress, it's not actual weight, because suppose we had in a composition two men on one side of this invisible axis and two women on the other side. I've had students in the past say, well, that's not true. It's lighter on the side that has the women, because they're thinking in terms of how much actual people weigh. And so they're saying, they're reasoning, well, they're two men. They would weigh more than the two women. So it's not about actual weight. It's about how many things are on each side and the kind of effects that are created on each side that determine the weight. And so we're talking about a visual weight, that appearance of heaviness or lightness. Now, there are different kinds of balance that are created. And in this kind that you're seeing here, this is called symmetrical balance. And in symmetrical balance, it means that you usually do have the same amount of things on both sides. So here, if you think of this as sort of that invisible axis that we actually see here in this work, and if you count how many flowers are in this row, there are 5 flowers. There are 5 flowers over there. Above the middle flower in this row, there's a face. Above the middle flower on this side, there's a face. 2 flowers on both sides of that face. You know, everything is exactly the same except for one thing, and that is the color that's used. You know, we have green and green, yellow, yellow, but then under this face we have, this is supposed to be a dark blue. It really looks black here, and we have a red here. But it's not enough to say that this is not a symmetrical balance. There's just not enough variation, because if you look at most of the other colors, there's a difference right here. We have this dark blue here. We have a red here. But there's very little difference. And again, here's a dark blue here and a red here. So we would say that this is symmetrically balanced, meaning it has the same weight on each side of the work and it's made by the same number of objects on each side of the work. Okay, and this is how you spell symmetrical balance here, S-Y-M-M-E-T-R-I-C-A-L. Now, most artists don't use symmetrical balance because they think it's rather boring. Artists have used it, you know, as Matisse does here in this work. Also, it's been used in sculpture, and I just want to show you an example of how it looks when it's in sculpture. In sculpture, what you have to do is you sort of draw that invisible line down the center of the sculptures, and then you look at how the sculpture is treated on each side. And, you know, if you look, you know, there's one leg on this side, there's a leg on this side, there's an arm on this side, arm on this side. There's very little that's different. The only difference is in this figure is that this arm is higher because it's resting on the other arm. But again, that's not enough to say that this is not a symmetrically balanced work. You know, it's so little, you know, that's different. Otherwise, you know, the head's treated the same way on both sides. And so in sculpture also, we can talk about a symmetrical balance. You just have to draw that vertical line when you're looking at a work and trying to figure out what kind of balance it is. More artists use asymmetrical balance because they think it's more interesting. It's not so boring. It's not monotonous. You know, who wants to see just the same thing repeated on the other side of this invisible line? And here you just have some of the ways. I'm going to show you lots of different ways that asymmetrical balance is created. These square, you know, these sort of dominoes that you see here all show you ways that more weight can be placed on one side than the other in composition. The only 2 that you see here that are balanced are the bottom 2. The 4 up here at the top aren't. If something is larger than something that's smaller, then the larger thing looks like it's heavier. If it's darker, you know, even though it may be the same size, but it's darker than on the other side, darkness tends to make something look heavier. Or if it's textured, you know, if it has a lot of pattern or texture about it, that makes it look heavier than something that isn't textured. Or, you know, again, we have the same size of circles here, but this circle is pulled farther away from the center. If things, you know, if your eye has to sort of travel a little bit farther to find objects away from that center line, that makes those objects look heavier too. So even though these are the same size, they're the same, you know, color, you know, they're white, they have really no color in them. Because this one's farther away, it looks a little heavier than the one that's right here in the center. So down here below, you see 2 compositions where artists have created equal weight on both sides of that line. On this side, they've used one larger object. On this side, because they know that one small object won't have as much weight, they've put 2 small objects. And so that gives more of a sense of equality in weight to the one big one that you have on that side. Or, you know, you have the one big one on that side, and so you put a smaller dark object on this side, and that makes this seem equal to this. If it were the same size, like this one up here, then that would make this side, the left side, look heavier than the right. So they've used a smaller circle, but they've given it that darkness so that it will be equal to that effect. So this is, these are all ways that asymmetrical balance is created in a work of art. And this is really the kind of balance that is preferred by artists for the most part. And so here we have a painting by Peter Paul Rubens called The Lion Hunt. This is an asymmetrical balanced work. If you think about, here's that invisible line that seems to be running up right about here. And you take a look, the first thing you should do is take a look at both sides. Are they equal? Is there equal things happening on both sides? No. Over here on this side, we have this big, dark, black area that represents a horse's body. We don't have that on the other side. Instead, we have this red color being represented instead of this big, black area. Mostly, that figure, if you think of that figure here in white, it's set on a diagonal, and most of the white of this gown and the brightest lit part of that gown is on the left side of that invisible line. So again, that diagonal and the brighter white tends to pull us over on this side. And so it's different from, again, we don't have quite as much brightness on this side in this figure, and the line is pulling us down and actually into this figure is what it's doing. So in that way, because there's a lighter amount right here and we're sort of directed down there, that helps to give equal weight on this side. So this is really asymmetrically balanced. And what he's done is he said, okay, I'm going to use a brighter color. I'll use red. That will attract attention. A lot of asymmetrical balance is about attracting your eye's attention and keeping you there longer. The longer that an artist can keep you there, then the more your brain is going to sense that there's heavier weight there. And so even though this red is smaller because it is red, it tends to attract more attention than this black area over here. And so that makes this look heavier. And then right behind it, there's more light. Again, white versus black. Actually, white tends to attract your eye more, particularly if it means that you can see more clouds, you can see more detail. And so that keeps us over here also longer. And so he's done, several, the lion, incidentally, I might mention, sometimes it's subject matter that does it. This lion is attacking this man in this lion hunt. And so the savagery of that lion attacking, that tends to hold our eye longer because we're looking, to see what is happening with that lion. And so, and then, we talked about focal point. If the focal point is sort of created on the right side, that creates more weight too. Look how the lines here, this spear here, this spear over here, this spear here, they're all pointing us towards that lion. They're really saying to us, look at that lion. And so again, that makes more weight. We just stay longer on that side. So, there are a number of ways in which asymmetrical balance can be created, by artists. And so you have to sort of look at what's going on each side. You have to decide, this looks different from this. And that is the first clue that should say, oh, this must be asymmetrical balance. It's never not balanced. Artists just don't usually create works of art that aren't balanced. But just because it doesn't look exactly the same on each side, don't say it's not balanced. That should be your clue. This must be asymmetrical balance. And so there are a number of ways that they can create it. As you see here on this one, if we draw the line, again, it tends to be about here in the center. So we have two women, but they're dressed differently. So that means, okay, it's not symmetrical balance. Must be asymmetrical. This one, is a duller sort of pink. And so at first you might say, well, that doesn't look like it balances against this really bright red sort of form. But there's more of it. Her body is larger than the area of red that we have right here. So because it's larger, it tends to look like it has more weight there than on the other side. So this, Gauguin, who painted this, said to himself, okay, what am I going to do on this side to make this side seem to have as much weight? Well, one, I'm going to use that brighter red. That'll help do it. And then in that bright red, I'm going to put these white flowers, that are more detailed. They have these little petals that are coming out here. And so he knew that people's eyes would tend to stay with that detail longer. And so that would make it look like there was more weight there. He also decided, I'll give her a white shirt to wear. That'll hold them there longer too because it's white. And so he did a number, and it's just a more complicated shape. This is sort of a simple shape, the way that this lady is sitting. But this lady, she's pushed out one of her legs, and so we're sort of brought out in a more complicated kind of shape. So that keeps us on that side as well. Light can also do it, as we've already sort of pointed out, as I pointed out in some of these earlier works. In this work, again, think about that middle line. And so what do we have on the middle line, on the right side? We have an adult man dressed in a robe, and we have this woman who's brightly highlighted. And on the other side, we just have one man who's bent over. He sort of forms a rounded or sort of oval kind of shape. We don't see him very well because mostly he's in shadow except for just a little line of white that's on his back. And so again, the artist seems to say, okay, I'm going to use these three figures and two of them are going to be on this side. And I'm going to highlight her because I really want her to be the focus of attention. I really want people to look at her. So what am I going to do on this side to give it equal weight, to give it an equal balance? And so he decided that what he would do is he would create an opening in the cave. This is a story about the early years of American colony society. This is a fictional story that took place. According to the story, this young girl was a white girl. She falls in love with an Indian, a Native American. And because of that, she's killed by white people. And this man doesn't look very Native American just because of the period of time when it was painted. But he's supposed to represent, a Native American. So according to the story, she's buried in a cave. And so we're inside this cave. And so this artist said, well, I need more weight on this left side. So I'll show an opening in that cave, as if they're close to the entrance to the cave. And outside that cave, I'll put this little bright area of sky, and I'll put a cross in that bright area of sky. He knew that, everybody would look at that cross because it's a familiar symbol. Everybody can identify it immediately, as being related to Christianity. And so he knew that people's eyes would go up there. And so he knew that would help to create more weight on this side to sort of counterbalance, what's going over here on this side. Another thing that you can do that I've mentioned is you can create more complicated shapes. And so this is by Goya. And again, if you think of the center axis sort of being right here, you have on this side, a big form of this woman. She's really looks much bigger than the man that's standing on the other side of her. And he's holding a parasol over her head. So there's another big oval sort of form. And so, Goya, again, must have said to himself, okay, I'm going to have these two big forms here with lots of heaviness on this side. What am I going to do over here to make this seem like it has equal weight. And so one of the things he did was to make more light in the background, as if we're seeing the sky, against a dark area here, which is supposed to be a rock formation. And then he also says, I'm going to put this branch with lots of little leaves on it because that's going to attract people's eyes. And you don't consciously say to yourself, I'm going to look at every one of those leaves, but that's what your brain does. It does look at all those leaves. So that keeps you on that side longer, and so it makes it feel like there's more weight on that side of the composition. Here are just some other ways that artists create, balance, equal balance on each side. If you have more detail on one side, that gives more weight. Here we have, and again, if you think of that vertical axis sort of dividing right here, we have two larger girls, and we have a very large ceramic urn right there. So we have three rather large objects on this side. So how is the artist going to balance on the other side? Well, he can do it by having one large girl, but then he has this smaller girl. He does have an urn, but we don't see it all. It's cut off, so we don't see the whole thing, so it doesn't have quite as much weight as this urn that we see more of. So, he decided, I will use a more patterned sort of carpet for this little girl to sit on. And people will spend a little time looking at the pattern, and so that'll give it more weight. And then he also gives us just a glimpse of a window in the background, and probably, some other room where we seem to be looking through a doorway into another room. And we just see a little bit of light coming in a window. And again, that light surrounded by all that dark tends to attract your attention. And so again, it's another way of creating, a little more weight on this side of the composition. Another thing he does is he has this stripe of red, pretty bright red. It's brighter than the rather dull sort of brownish rust sort of color that we see over here in the wall. So again, that attracts your attention. So, there are a number of ways in which an artist creates this asymmetrical kind of balance. And they usually use it because it seems more natural. We don't see things in our world in a very balanced sort of way. And so it makes it look more lively, more, natural. Now, there is one kind of balance that I want to mention to you, and that's what's called radial balance. And you see a good example of that here. You also see it sometimes in landscapes, but it's hard to see. And it isn't a kind of, I may ask you to explain what radial balance is, but I wouldn't show you a slide and say that was radial balance and expect you to see it, because it's rather hard to see. It's very easy here in this one to see because it's not objective. It's a lot harder if you're looking at a landscape or something like that. In radial balance means that no matter which side, left or right, top or bottom, exactly the same things go on. So it's sort of like saying this is symmetrical balance in this direction. It's symmetrical balance in this direction. And it's radial because it does give you sort of that effect of a wheel-like form, that's sort of curving, in space. So as I said, I might ask you to identify this or to define it or match it on the exam. I wouldn't ask you to actually see it in a work of art and to tell me that it's radial balance. So with that, we've gone through all of the principles of design, and remember that these are things that are used to organize the visual elements, to organize shapes, color, lines in a composition. This is the list of terms that I put on your handout that you have also. Goes on for a couple of pages because it includes all the terms from the visual elements on that handout. And for the exam, make sure that you know ways in which an artist creates unity in a composition. We talked about that. One way is repetition of shapes or repetition of colors, repetition of textures. Another way is continuation, that one thing seems to lead your eye into another thing. Another one is proximity, that things are just close together. They're touching often. Those are some of the ways that they create unity. Make sure you know how artists create emphasis or focal point. And we talked about directional line doing that. We talked about use of light, creating focal points. Color, contrasts of color. If you have one white against, and then everything else in the work is different hues, reds, blues, yellows, whatever, the white's going to draw your attention. Or texture, if there's one thing textured and all the rest of it isn't, that's going to draw your attention. So make sure that you know those ways that we talked about for creating focal point. Make sure you know, first of all, what symmetrical balance is, as well as radial balance. But make sure you know how artists create that asymmetrical balance. How do they create that equal weight on both sides of a composition? And then finally, I might ask you a question about how do artists, or why do artists sometimes create proportions or scale that don't look right, that don't look normal. The figures may look too tall and thin, or the heads may be too big, or, something like that. Make sure that you could talk about that if I ask a question. And so that's the kind of things that we're going to do on the exam. Now, I want to sort of review you and talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been talking about. If I ask you, to talk about this for treatment of shape, what would be some of the things that you could say? How would you describe the shapes in this work?
Geometrical?
Yeah, geometric. Are there any organic sorts of shapes in this work? There's this sort of shape. It sort of starts out this way, and then it jags, and then it comes around. It sort of curves. It does end in something that looks a little geometric here at the end, but this is really an organic sort of shape. When it seems to be irregular or sort of changes direction, that's what we're talking about, organic shapes. Organic shapes do not always have to depict representational things, and here it really doesn't. It's just a shape, a non-objective sort of shape that you can still call a non-objective sort of shape, an organic shape. What draws your attention? Where's the focal point, would you say?
The newspaper.
The newspaper. What is it about the newspaper? Why does that draw your attention? Okay, contrast, but also the letters. Just you can recognize letters and words, even if they were in, as they are here in this particular part, in a foreign language. This is French. You still sort of gravitate towards things you know. And so that, first of all, creates a focal point. And then if you look, there are lines that are pulling you down. These dark lines here in this, this line is sort of pulling you over in this direction. There are other things that are pulling you over to where we see all these letters. You could also talk about different values in this work. Remember, values are the light and dark. And in this particular work, this form right here is certainly dark. And so it is, that end of the value scale. It'd be called a low dark or a dark. The white areas around here are the high lights, the high areas. And then these brown areas that are sort of in between, they're not as dark as the dark, they're not as light as the light. We would call these middle values in between. So you could talk about values, for something like that. Now, for this one, how would you describe the color for this one? Is it, and I'll just give you some ideas. Is it local color? Is it optical color? Is it arbitrary color? What would you say? And sometimes there can be both. Is there anything that looks local? What do we know? What is local color?
What it's supposed to be?
Yeah, what we expect it to be. And so, green trees, that's local. But look at the ground here. The ground's very yellow. I mean, you know, sometimes we do have dry land out here in western Kansas, and so it does look rather yellow. But this is such a flat sort of yellow that it really doesn't look local or what we really expect to see. And you know, over here behind this figure, all of this orange here, you know, that just seems to be going up. What is that? You know, what is it supposed to represent? So besides some local color, a lot of the kind of color that's used here in this work we would call arbitrary, meaning that the artist made the choice of the color. You know, he wasn't influenced particularly by nature. Maybe he had another reason for wanting to paint it like this, for choosing these colors. Maybe if I gave you the title of this, you might get some idea about some of those reasons. This painting he called The Joy of Life. And so he chose yellows and oranges because he thought of those maybe as happy colors. They're bright. And so he's really talking more about his feelings and how he represents his feelings in color rather than just saying, I'm painting a scene I saw. You wouldn't really expect a yellow ground, you know, if he were just painting things to look naturalistic. So you could talk about the color in that way. You could talk about it in terms of primary, secondary colors. Primaries are the red, the yellow, and the blue. Secondaries are green, orange, and purple. So you could talk about that. And so, you know, you could talk about color and how it's used in a work like this. You could also talk about how he treats figures. You know, do those figures look very naturalistic? Would you call them naturalistic, or would you call them abstract or non-objective? They're actually abstract. You know, remember that naturalistic means there's lots of detail, and if you look at these figures, he's really simplified the figures, and then look at how he's treated them. Sort of this emphasis is like, almost like she's got this really lumpy, bumpy sort of hip there. This one almost looks like she's had some kind of problem with her hip bone. It's broken or something and set in the wrong way. He has a strange sort of lump here. So in other words, these are abstracted. He has somehow distorted or changed them from what naturalistic would be. And for him, the reason was expression again. You know, this was his way of creating some of this emotional reaction that he wants to give you. What would you say about this work in terms of the shapes? What kind of shapes are here?
Organic.
Organic, right. Why? Right, they're human beings. Human beings are just automatically organic, although we saw Picasso and Cubism treat them in a very geometric shape. You know, they could be treated in geometric shapes. But these are organic. What else could you say about them?
Representational.
Yeah, they're representational. They're naturalistic to a great extent, but you know, when you look at her head, it's sort of like he's really emphasized sort of a perfect sort of oval of her head. So, you know, if someone would say, well, I kind of think it's abstracted, and point out, you know, that her head looks a little bit too perfect, a little bit too oval, you know, I would give you credit for that. If I see what you see and I understand why you said it, and if you explain yourself to me, then I'm may give you, credit. It sort of depends, if you are just off the wall with what you're saying. If you're talking about the trees in this work, and I'm looking at the work and I'm saying, trees, where are the trees? Then of course, and there are some trees, just very few trees, but they're in the background here. Okay, so you could talk about that. Is there anything you could say in terms of depth? Is there an illusion of depth in this work? How's he created then, if there's depth? Size, right. Color, right. What happens to the color? Yeah, it's getting lighter in the back. It's much darker. It's more saturated in the front. Overlapping. Remember overlapping? She's sitting there and she's overlapping this table she's leaning on. And so that creates a sense of depth. Also, the way the tabletop, this diagonal line, seems to be going back. That helps to create some depth. We don't see much perspective here in terms of, lines leading us back into space. But, these other things you could talk about for that. How about this one? What would you say about how the illusion of depth is created in this work? Pardon me? Yeah, the size. Again. Overlapping. Again. Placement. Remember placement, where things are placed higher. Particularly if they're smaller, too, then they look like they're farther back. And then linear perspective, that one-point perspective is used here. All these edges of the squares create that implied sort of continuous diagonal line. And if you would trace all these lines out, you would see that they all come together here in the door. So linear perspective is being used, or that one-point perspective is being used here. In this work. Do the proportions seem natural? Or are they a little off? And don't the figures look a little tall? They have rather small heads, and they have a rather tall figure. So the proportions aren't entirely correct here. And this artist he happens to have a formula for the way he treats figures, no matter what work that you look at. From this period of time, he always creates these sort of S-curved sort of figures. So the pose, it looks natural, and yet it's sort of artificial. It's not completely natural. The painter that actually created this is Raphael, and he becomes much better later on. This is when he was a very young artist at the beginning of his life, when he painted this. Okay, we've already talked about that. Let's go. What would you say about this? What kind of shapes? Do you see anything recognizable?
Circle.
They're circles, but do those represent anything in nature? They look like geometric circles, don't they? So you would probably say for this, it's non-objective. This is not representational at all. There's nothing representational. Actually, there is, but, I certainly wouldn't count you off if you said this is non-representational. This area right here is supposed to represent the moon. And, it's sort of yellow and is rounded, similar to the moon. But, if you just said these are just circles, these are just geometric shapes, I would certainly give you total credit for something like that. So, you could describe them as geometric, you could describe them as non-objective. What kind of color is used here? Are they primary colors? Yeah, primary and secondary. And if you say that on the test, make sure you mention what they are, so that you know that I know that you know what primary colors are or secondary colors. You could say that. do you think that they're, what are they used for? Contrast, that's part of it, yeah. It tends to what? Make them all look brighter because of the contrast. Do they create sort of a sense of movement? Look how he uses this green, and then we sort of skip over, and we come to some more green, and then we go to green. He's sort of circling us around in the composition with those colors, just like, the shapes are pulling us around. He's sort of creating an effect that there's rotation taking place here. So, you could talk about that. For him, just personally, this is something you wouldn't know necessarily. He thought that by doing things like that, he could create harmonies of music. He was trying to create visual art that would somehow be similar to music. And so he thought by putting these different relationships of colors together, he was creating almost like musical tones in this. But that's a very personal thing. And, he expected everybody to understand that, but you don't. Some people might say, yeah, I can see that, and other people say, I don't see it at all. So it's really a very personal sort of thing that he was trying to do. Okay, well, I think I'll let you go then at this point. On Tuesday, we will have the exam, and I won't be here the following Thursday. So I just want to keep reminding you of that. I will have the rest of your papers in the art office, 102, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock.